December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m. The first 1,800-pound bomb tears through the deck of USS Arizona, detonating the forward magazine. 1 million pounds of gunpowder explodes in a fireball that rises 500 feet into the Hawaiian sky. The shockwave kills 1,177 men in 9 seconds. Within 2 hours, 2,400 Americans are dead, 21 warships destroyed or crippled, and the Pacific Fleet burns in shallow water. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo smiles. He believes Japan has already won. He is about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more fascinating stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Let's uncover history together. This is the story of the deadliest intelligence failure of the 20th century. Not a failure of data, but a failure of imagination. Japanese military planners possessed every fact about American industrial capacity. They knew the numbers. They saw the factories. They understood the math. Yet they convinced themselves that a nation of soft individualists obsessed with comfort and pleasure would never sustain a war 5,000 miles from home. They believed spiritual superiority would triumph over steel mills and oil fields. The result was total national destruction. The Imperial Japanese Navy annihilated 67 cities, leveled over 2 million military personnel killed, and 2 atomic bombs that changed warfare forever. The intelligence was there. The warning signs were everywhere. One man saw it all coming and tried desperately to stop it. But nobody listened. And when the war began exactly as he predicted, it was already too late. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in his cabin aboard the flagship Nagato, reading reports from Pearl Harbor. His staff officers celebrated. Champagne flowed in the wardrooms. Victory disease, they would later call it. But Yamamoto felt only dread. He had studied at Harvard. He had walked the streets of Detroit and seen the automobile factories. He had visited the Texas oil fields. He knew what his colleagues in Tokyo refused to believe: America was not weak. America was sleeping. And Japan had just kicked it awake with a fury that would not stop until the Japanese Empire was ash. 6 months earlier, in a meeting with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, Yamamoto had delivered his prophecy. "If I am told to fight regardless of consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." The words were preserved in Konoe's memoir. They would prove devastatingly precisely accurate. The Battle of Midway, Japan's first catastrophic defeat, would occur exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. But how did Japan arrive at this moment of supreme miscalculation? How did a nation with access to accurate intelligence data convince itself that defeating America was possible? The answer lies in a toxic combination of cultural arrogance, historical misanalogy, and a fundamental misreading of American character. Japanese pre-war assessments rested on 2 ideological pillars that seemed unshakable. The first was Yamato Damashi Japanese spirit, the belief that the Japanese possessed unique spiritual superiority that could overcome any material disadvantage. This was not propaganda. It was deeply held conviction, rooted in centuries of tradition, and reinforced by the Meiji era's miraculous modernization. Japan had transformed itself from feudal isolation to world power in a single generation through sheer collective will. Surely that same spirit could overcome American materialism. The second pillar was Bushido, the warrior code that dictated death before surrender. Japanese planners assumed their enemies lacked equivalent resolve. Japanese soldiers trained to die for their emperor. American soldiers, they believed, fought for money and comfort and would flee when casualties mounted. One American diplomat stationed in pre-war Nagoya reported that while Japanese elites genuinely admired American industrial achievements, they had very little appreciation for American cultural or spiritual attainments. Americans were seen as technically skillful but intellectually underdeveloped, pleasure-seeking, incapable of collective sacrifice. History appeared to validate these assumptions. Japan had defeated China in 1895, seizing Taiwan and dominating Korea. More remarkably, Japan had defeated Russia in 1905, despite being materially weaker. The Russo-Japanese War proved that an Asian nation could defeat a European great power through superior fighting spirit and strategic audacity. The victory over Russia became the template for war with America. A surprise naval attack at Port Arthur had crippled the Russian Pacific Fleet before war was declared. The subsequent land campaign in Manchuria had been brutal and costly, but Japan prevailed through tenacity and willingness to accept casualties that would have broken a softer nation. The Battle of Tsushima annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet after its 18,000-mile journey, a victory so complete it remains one of history's most one-sided naval engagements. Most importantly, Russia sued for peace. The larger, wealthier, more populous power concluded victory was not worth the cost, and negotiated terms favorable to Japan. Japanese planners in 1941 explicitly modeled their strategy on this precedent. Launch a surprise attack to cripple American naval power. Seize a vast defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Inflict casualties so severe that Americans soft and comfort-loving would calculate that retaking distant colonial possessions was not worth the blood and treasure required. America would negotiate just as Russia had. The plan seemed logical, even inevitable. American racial diversity was viewed as critical weakness, where Japan saw racial homogeneity as national strength. A single people united by blood and culture, and Emperor America's immigrant population, was interpreted as proof the country would fracture under pressure. How could a nation of Germans and Irish and Italians and Jews and Africans, people sharing no common ancestry or faith, possibly unite for prolonged sacrifice? American democracy was seen as producing indecisiveness, factional squabbling, and inability to sustain losses. Democracies. Japanese strategists believed were inherently weak in war because leaders had to answer to public opinion rather than acting decisively. Not every Japanese leader shared this delusion. Yamamoto had spent years in America and knew how dangerous these assumptions were. He studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, traveling extensively through the American heartland. He visited Detroit's automobile factories. He walked through Texas oil fields. He became an avid poker player, learning about calculated risk bluffing and knowing when you were beaten. What he saw in America terrified him. Unlike colleagues in Tokyo who knew America only through diplomatic cables and intelligence reports, Yamamoto had walked American streets, spoken with American workers, seen American industry firsthand. He understood that the cheerful consumer society masked enormous latent power. Those automobile factories could become tank factories. Those oil fields could fuel fleets larger than anything Japan could imagine. Those casual, informal Americans, who seemed undisciplined, could, when roused, display determination, matching any samurai. His warnings were blunt. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. To school children in 1940, he said simply, "Japan cannot beat America. Therefore, Japan should not fight America." In late 1940, Yamamoto warned Prime Minister Konoe of exactly what war with America would bring. "If I am told to fight regardless of consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." The quote proved devastatingly prophetic. Yamamoto also wrote what appeared to be a boast, but was actually a warning about impossibility. In a letter to politician Ryoichi Sasakawa, dated January 24, 1941, he stated, "Should hostilities break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate terms in the White House." He meant this as proof of impossibility. Total conquest of continental United States was obviously impossible. Therefore, total victory was impossible. Therefore, war should be avoided. But Yamamoto's dissent changed nothing. The army dominated Japanese politics. The army wanted war. Yamamoto was sent to sea as combined fleet commander, partly to protect him from militarist assassins who opposed his anti-war stance. Ultra-nationalist fanatics had already murdered several prominent opponents of war. When conflict became inevitable, despite his warnings, Yamamoto concluded that if war had to be fought, he could not see anyone but himself commanding it. He conceived Pearl Harbor as a desperate gamble to buy time. Not win outright a knockout blow that might give Japan breathing room before American industrial power could mobilize. The December 1, 1941 Imperial Conference that approved war rested on 5 interconnected assumptions. Every single one proved catastrophically wrong. First, Japanese leaders believed American isolationism ran so deep it would persist even after attack. They noted the America First movement congressional reluctance to arm widespread desire to avoid foreign wars. Surely an attack in the distant Pacific would not reverse these sentiments. Second, they assumed the war would be fought too far from the American mainland for citizens to sustain interest. The Philippines and Guam meant nothing to Kansas farmers or New York factory workers. Why would they sacrifice sons for islands they could not find on a map? Third, they expected destroying the Pacific Fleet would eliminate American power projection for 12 to 18 months, during which Japan could consolidate a defensive perimeter so costly to penetrate that America would accept the fait accompli rather than pay the price. Fourth, they believed Germany would keep Britain and the United States occupied in Europe. The Atlantic would demand American attention. Japan would face only a portion of American power divided across two oceans. Fifth, and most critically, they assumed Americans unwilling to sustain heavy casualties for distant colonial possessions would negotiate peace on favorable terms, just as Russia had in 1905. Chief of Naval Staff Admiral Osami Nagano articulated the fatalism pervading Japanese decision-making in those final days. Since Japan is unavoidably facing national ruin whether it decides to fight or not, it must by all means choose to fight. This was not strategic thinking. It was fatalistic acceptance of probable disaster, combined with hope that spirit might somehow prevail. The speed of Japan's initial conquests exceeded even optimistic projections. In 6 months, the Japanese Empire expanded to encompass roughly 1/7 of the globe's surface. Japanese planners had expected to lose 1/4 of their forces in initial offensives. Actual losses were negligible. Victory disease Senshubyo infected every level of command. Guam fell. December 10th, after just hours of fighting, its garrison of 550 personnel had only 100 rifles, no artillery, no aircraft. Wake Island held heroically for 16 days. On December 11th, Wake's defenders repelled the first Japanese amphibious assault shore batteries and marine wildcats, sinking destroyers, Hayat and Kisaragi. It was the only time in the Pacific War that amphibious landing was repelled. Wake fell December 23rd, but its resistance delayed the Japanese timetable and inflicted losses that embarrassed Tokyo. Singapore fell. February 15th, 1942, with 85,000 Allied and Commonwealth troops surrendering the largest capitulation in British history. Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita had captured the impregnable fortress in 70 days, attacking down the Malay Peninsula from the north, while British guns pointed uselessly out to sea. The Philippines produced the largest American surrender in history. After 3 months of desperate resistance on Bataan Peninsula, where troops on half rations suffered malaria, dysentery, and beriberi. Major General Edward King surrendered approximately 75,000 American and Filipino troops on April 9, 1942. The subsequent Bataan Death March killed an estimated 500 to 650 Americans, and between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipinos over 65 miles of forced marching in tropical heat without adequate food or water. These victories reinforced every Japanese assumption. American forces had surrendered by tens of thousands. British forces had surrendered by tens of thousands. The supposedly invincible white colonial powers had crumbled at first serious challenge. By March 1942, Japanese military leadership concluded their war plans had been too conservative and pessimistic. Perhaps spirit really could triumph over material. Yet even in defeat, the Allies had shown something Japanese planners refused to recognize. The Bataan defense had delayed Japan's timetable by months. Wake Island's Marines had inflicted the only successful repulse of Japanese landing in the entire initial offensive. These were early signals that American and Allied fighting quality had been underestimated. Signals Japan chose to ignore in the flush of victory. Then came April 18, 1942. 16 B-25. Mitchell bombers under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched from USS Hornet, approximately 650 miles from Japan. It was the first time medium bombers had ever flown from carrier deck in combat, an improvisation that seemed impossible until American audacity made it real. 80 volunteer airmen flew what they knew was essentially a one-way mission. The bombers could not land back on the carrier. They would strike Japan and continue to China, hoping to reach friendly territory before fuel ran out. Physical damage to Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe was minimal. A few dozen buildings destroyed, roughly 50 Japanese killed, but the psychological impact was seismic. For America, it was a morale lifeline during the war's darkest period. For Japan, the raid exposed homeland defense as fiction and embarrassed military leadership who had promised the emperor his sacred person would never be endangered by enemy attack. 4 Army fighter groups were retained in home islands for air defense, even though desperately needed in the South Pacific. Most critically, the Doolittle raid convinced the Japanese army, which had previously opposed Yamamoto's plan to attack Midway, to support the operation. After American bombers appeared over Tokyo, the army could no longer argue that the American carrier threat was tolerable. The rushed, overconfident Midway operation that followed led directly to Japan's worst naval disaster. The Battle of Midway, fought June 4th through 7th, 1942, was the Pacific War's decisive turning point. It came almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, just as Yamamoto had predicted. The Americans should not have won. Yamamoto brought 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, and over 250 aircraft. The Americans had 3 carriers, no battleships, and roughly 230 aircraft. Japanese pilots were combat veterans with years of experience. Many American pilots had never seen combat, but the Americans had broken the Japanese naval code. Commander Joseph Rochefort's Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor had penetrated the JN-25B cipher, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz something Yamamoto did not know. He lacked accurate intelligence about Japanese intentions. Nimitz knew Yamamoto's target timing and force composition. When Washington doubted the target was actually Midway, Lieutenant Jasper Holmes devised ingenious confirmation. The Midway garrison sent an unencrypted message reporting its water distillation plant had broken down. Japanese intelligence was intercepted shortly after reporting that AF, the Japanese designation for their target, is short of water. Target confirmed. Nimitz committed virtually everything the U.S. Navy had in the Pacific. 3 carriers, including Yorktown, that had been so badly damaged at Coral Sea, the Japanese believed her sunk. Pearl Harbor shipyard workers performed miracles, completing 3 months of repairs in just 72 hours. It was massive gamble based largely on intelligence. If Rochefort was wrong, the Pacific Fleet would sail into a trap. The battle's pivotal minutes came approximately 10:20 a.m. on June 4th, when SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived above Admiral Nagumo's carriers, essentially unopposed at high altitude. Their sacrifice had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level. When dive bombers arrived from high altitude, no Japanese fighters were positioned to intercept. The dive bombers struck 3 carriers within minutes. Akagi Kaga and Soryu were fatally hit. Their flight decks turned into infernos as fuel and ammunition exploded. Hiryu escaped initial attack and launched counterstrike that damaged Yorktown. But American dive bombers found Hiryu that afternoon and sent her to bottom as well. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, the core of the force that attacked Pearl Harbor, along with heavy cruiser, more than 300 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 personnel. America lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, about 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel. Yamamoto's 6-month prediction had proven exact. The period during which Japan could run wild was over, and now the real war was about to begin. Midway shattered Japan's aura of invincibility. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, 3,000 personnel dead, the elite pilots who had trained for years gone. But Japanese leadership concealed the truth. Midway was announced to the Japanese public as a victory. Sunken carriers remained on naval rosters as unmanned. Wounded sailors were sequestered in separate hospitals. Family visits prohibited to prevent word from spreading. The Japanese people would not learn the truth until after the war. 2 months later, August 7, 1942. The 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandegrift, landed on Guadalcanal in the steaming Solomon Islands. The target was a half-completed Japanese airfield on an obscure island most Americans had never heard of. That airfield, renamed Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at Midway, became the campaign's center of gravity for 6 brutal months. And it shocked Japanese assumptions about American fighting quality even more profoundly than Midway had shocked their confidence at sea. Japanese commanders repeatedly underestimated American strength and resolve. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki landed 916 men on August 21st, expecting to overwhelm what intelligence told him was a small, demoralized garrison. In a savage night battle along the Tanaru River, Marines annihilated his force. Approximately 800 Japanese were killed against 150 American casualties. Ichiki himself burned his regimental colors and died in the fighting, possibly by his own hand. The Japanese military could not accept that American troops had outfought elite Japanese soldiers in close combat. There must have been some other explanation. Perhaps Ichiki's force was too small. Perhaps they attacked in the wrong place. Surely more troops would succeed where fewer had failed. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 6,000-man assault at Edson's Ridge in September was defeated with over 50% casualties. The climactic battle for Henderson Field, from October 23rd through 26th, saw Japanese forces hurl themselves against Marine and Army positions in wave after wave of frontal assault. The direct assault force under General Maruyama numbered approximately 7,000 troops. The defenders sustained approximately 60 killed, while inflicting between 1,500 and 3,000 Japanese dead. During this battle, Sergeant John Basilone commanded 2 sections of heavy machine guns against approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers. For 3 days and nights without sleep, rest, or food, he kept his guns firing. When one section was destroyed, he carried a 90-pound machine gun 200 yards under fire to replace it. When ammunition ran out, he fought through Japanese lines with pistol and machete to resupply his men. He became the first enlisted Marine in World War II to receive the Medal of Honor. His words afterward captured both modesty and devotion. "Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal." He later refused an officer's commission and stateside posting. "I ain't no officer, and I ain't no museum piece. I belong back with my outfit." He requested return to combat and was killed on Iwo Jima's first day. He remains the only enlisted Marine in history to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. Japanese Captain Toshikazu Omai, writing in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings after the war, identified what the campaign revealed. The outstanding feature in the Guadalcanal campaign was the employment of radar by the United States, which completely reversed the Japanese Navy's traditional superiority in night engagements. The fact that the Japanese lost confidence in night engagements was a bad influence upon the morale of the men. The Japanese renamed Guadalcanal Starvation Island, a bitter pun on its Japanese pronunciation. Japanese troops died by thousands, not from American bullets, but from disease and malnutrition, as American air power and naval forces strangled their supply lines. When Japan finally evacuated 11,000 survivors in February 1943, it had lost approximately 25,000 to 31,000 troops, killed approximately 680 aircraft destroyed, and 38 naval vessels sunk. But the most devastating miscalculation underlying all Japan's failures was industrial. Japanese planners possessed the data. They knew American factories, steel production, and shipyard capacity dwarfed their own. What they could not conceive was the speed and scale at which America would convert its peacetime economy into a war machine, or the willingness of American society to sustain that effort year after year. The numbers explain everything that followed. In 1937, according to historian Paul Kennedy, the United States held 41.7% of the world's total war-making potential. Japan held 3.5%. The U.S. economy was roughly 10 times Japan's size. American steel production was 5 times greater, coal production 7 times greater, automobile production 80 times greater. In 1941, America produced over 3.6 million civilian automobiles. After Pearl Harbor, civilian production essentially ceased. Only 139 civilian cars were manufactured in 1943, and approximately 610 in 1944. The entire American auto industry converted to war production with impossible speed. The Ford Willow Run plant, the largest factory under one roof in history, with mile-long assembly line, produced 8,685 B-24 Liberator bombers, eventually rolling one off the line every 63 minutes. Chrysler, which had never built a tank, constructed the Detroit Arsenal tank plant and became one of the largest tank producers in the world. The shipbuilding comparison tells the story most vividly. During the conflict, the United States built more than 150 aircraft carriers of all types. Japan built 17. America built 10 new battleships to Japan's 2. America built 349 destroyers to Japan's 63. America built 203 submarines to Japan's 167. The Liberty Ship program epitomized American industrial genius. Henry Kaiser's shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945. Early in the war, each ship took 355 days to complete. By 1943, average construction time had dropped to 41 days. The record, the SS Robert E. Peary, was assembled in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. Aircraft production was equally lopsided. The United States produced 324,750 aircraft during the war versus Japan's 76,320. But the most devastating statistic is this. In 1944 alone, American factories built 96,318 aircraft more planes in a single year than Japan produced in the entire war. The pilot replacement crisis illustrated the asymmetry most cruelly. At Pearl Harbor, the average Japanese naval pilot had over 700 hours of flight time. Japan's pre-war training program was ultra-selective, accepting some years fewer than 100 candidates from thousands of applicants. These pilots were superb, among the best in the world, but Japan had no rotation system. Pilots flew combat until they were killed. America took the opposite approach. Experienced pilots were rotated home to become instructors, multiplying their skills through thousands of new aviators. By mid-1943, Allied pilots noticed sharp decline in Japanese flying skills as veterans died and were replaced by barely trained novices. By 1944, fuel shortages meant new Japanese pilots sometimes trained on gliders. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, exposed the result. American pilots shot down Japanese aircraft at approximately 12-to-1 kill ratio on the first day. Across the entire battle, American naval aviation and anti-aircraft fire destroyed nearly 600 Japanese aircraft and sank 3 carriers. Japan's naval air power was permanently annihilated. The island-hopping campaign demonstrated relentless American learning. Each costly battle produced rapid tactical adaptation. Tarawa in November 1943 was brutal tutorial. Marines took it in 76 hours, but at horrific cost, 1,009 killed and 2,101 wounded. The lessons were immediately absorbed. The Navy created underwater demolition teams. New armored amphibious tractors were developed. Pre-landing bombardment procedures were reformed. Saipan in June and July 1944 pierced Japan's absolute national defense zone and put B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. Of roughly 32,000 Japanese defenders, only 931 surrendered. The fall of Saipan forced resignation of Prime Minister Tojo, implicitly acknowledging his assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. By summer 1945, the consequences of misjudging America were total. The Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as effective fighting force. Japan's oil supply had collapsed more than 90% from its 1943 level. American submarines and aircraft had destroyed the merchant fleet connecting Japan to conquered territories. 67 Japanese cities had been bombed, many burned to ash. The March 9th and 10th firebombing of Tokyo alone killed at least 83,000 people, more than either atomic bombing. Approximately 40% of Japan's total urban area was destroyed. The 1945 rice harvest was worst since 1909. Food availability dropped to 1,680 calories per day for industrial workers, a starvation diet. Japan's misjudgment of America was not primarily intelligence failure. It was failure of imagination. The error was threefold. First, they confused material comfort with spiritual weakness. Pearl Harbor did not demoralize America. It unified the country with fury that persisted until unconditional surrender. Second, they applied the Russo-Japanese war template to fundamentally different adversary. Third, they projected their own cultural framework onto the enemy. Yamamoto saw it coming. His final reflection, written after Pearl Harbor, deserves to close this account. Britain and America may have underestimated Japan somewhat, but from their point of view, it is like having one's hand bitten rather badly by a dog one was feeding. The mindless rejoicing at home is really deplorable. He was killed April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid. American P-38 fighters, guided by broken Japanese codes, ambushed his transport over Bougainville. His body was found still clutching his samurai sword, a relic of martial tradition that had led his nation to ruin. From Yamamoto's warning that Japan could run wild for 6 months, to Midway's catastrophic carrier losses exactly on schedule, to Guadalcanal's brutal revelation that American troops could outfight Japanese soldiers, to the industrial tsunami that buried Japan under an avalanche of ships, planes, and munitions it could never hope to match. The arc of Japan's defeat was not determined by any single battle, but by a fundamental miscalculation made before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. But what happened to the men who saw it coming? What became of those who tried to prevent the catastrophe? Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto never saw Japan's final defeat. He died April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid proved his warnings about Tokyo's vulnerability correct. American codebreakers intercepted his flight itinerary. 18 P-38. Lightning fighters flew 435 miles at wave-top height to intercept his transport over Bougainville. At precisely 9:34 a.m., Captain Thomas Lanfear's guns tore into Yamamoto's aircraft. It crashed into the jungle. His body was found the next day, still in his seat, still clutching his samurai sword. The man who had predicted Japan's defeat with eerie precision, who had begged his government not to fight America, who had designed Pearl Harbor as a desperate gamble to buy time rather than win outright, never witnessed the full horror his warnings had foretold. Perhaps that was mercy. He was spared seeing the firebombing of Tokyo that killed more than both atomic bombs combined. He was spared watching the super battleship Yamato, pride of the fleet he commanded, sorted on a suicide mission with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. He was spared witnessing his nation's unconditional surrender aboard USS Missouri. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the man who had declared, "I am completely relieved," hours before Pearl Harbor, believing Japan had practically won, already faced a different fate. After Saipan fell in July 1944, piercing Japan's absolute defense perimeter and putting B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo, Tojo was forced to resign. His promises that American spirit would break, that the war would end in negotiated peace favorable to Japan, that Yamato Damashi would triumph over industrial capacity, all lay shattered. On September 11, 1945, hours after General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Japan to accept surrender, American military police came to arrest Tojo as a war criminal. He shot himself in the chest with a .32 caliber pistol aiming for his heart. He missed. American doctors saved his life. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal on December 26, 1947, when asked about Pearl Harbor, he replied simply, "Yes, I am responsible." He was hanged December 23, 1948, exactly 3 years after Yamamoto had died. Trying to prevent the war, Tojo had insisted on fighting. Prince Fumimaro Konoe, who had tried desperately to arrange a direct summit with President Roosevelt in summer 1941 to prevent war, who had sided with Yamamoto that withdrawing from China was preferable to catastrophic conflict with America, offered a revealing post-war admission before taking his own life. The Emperor and I and most of the cabinet were for acceptance of the American terms that we withdraw from China, but Tojo, with the backing of the military, violently opposed. Konoe took cyanide. December 16, 1945, the day before he was to report to prison as a suspected war criminal. But Yamamoto's legacy transcended his death. His prophecy became one of the most studied predictions in military history precisely because it proved so devastatingly accurate. Military academies worldwide now teach his warnings as a case study in how intelligence and foresight mean nothing if political will forces war, regardless of strategic about an adversary's capacity and will. The kamikaze adoption in October 1944 was final admission that Japan could no longer train pilots capable of conventional combat. If pilots were going to die anyway, they might as well die hitting something. By war's end, Japan had prepared more than 10,000 aircraft for kamikaze operations against anticipated Allied invasion. The doctrine of Ichioku Jokusa, 100 million shattered jewels, announced official willingness to sacrifice the entire Japanese population, including colonial subjects, in final resistance. It never came to that. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people, mostly civilians. Emperor Hirohito announced surrender, August 15th, citing a new and most cruel bomb that threatened the total extinction of human civilization. But Japan had already lost. The atomic bombs simply made undeniable what had been inevitable since Midway, perhaps since the moment Tojo dismissed Yamamoto's warnings and chose war. The consequences were total. Japan's military was dissolved. American occupation lasted 7 years. The nation that had sought to create an Asian empire under its domination became a pacifist democracy forbidden by its American written constitution from maintaining offensive military capability. From 1941's arrogant confidence that spirit would triumph over steel to 1945's utter devastation and unconditional surrender, Japan's trajectory proved that the deadliest intelligence failures are not failures of data, but failures of imagination. And here is the final, often overlooked detail that closes this story. In January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto wrote to newspaper editor Ogata Takatora. The letter revealed what the admiral truly felt about Japan's opening strike. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply for the one smitten. Even in Japan's moment of greatest triumph, Yamamoto felt no victory, only foreboding. From a nation that convinced itself racial purity and warrior spirit could defeat an industrial reality. His famous letter stating he would have utterly no confidence for the second or third year is quoted in every major text on the Pacific War. The broader lesson echoed far beyond World War II. Japan's catastrophic misjudgment of America spawned an entire field of strategic studies, examining how nations convince themselves that cultural superiority can overcome material disadvantage, how historical analogies mislead when applied to fundamentally different adversaries, how projecting one's own cultural framework onto enemies produces fatal blind spots. The Russo-Japanese war template that seemed so compelling in 1941, Japan's proof that an Asian power could defeat a larger Western nation through spirit and surprise attack followed by negotiated peace, was studied intensively after 1945. Analysts identified its seductive danger. Russia in 1905 was a corrupt autocracy, fighting an unpopular war 5,000 miles from its capital, with a population that included restive minorities and revolutionary movements. America in 1941 was a continental democracy with unified population, no domestic unrest, vast untapped industrial capacity, and a Pearl Harbor attack that transformed isolationism into white-hot determination overnight. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey deployed approximately 1,100 agents to Japan after surrender, systematically documenting the scale of miscalculation. Investigators secured principal surviving Japanese records and interrogated top officers, government officials, industrialists, political leaders. Their core finding was damning Japanese military leaders did not think America could instill martial spirit in its populace. They had been catastrophically wrong. Japan's intelligence estimates proved almost comically inaccurate. Japan estimated U.S. Navy personnel strength at approximately 309,000 by late 1943. The actual number was 2.37 million, an underestimate by a factor of 7. Japan estimated American merchant ship construction at 5 million tons for 1943. The actual figure was 19.2 million tons. These were not marginal errors. These were civilization-level miscalculations, giant, 10 times its size to the complete destruction of that nation's military economy and imperial ambitions. Japan's fatal error proved that wars are won by accurate assessment of enemy capabilities, and will not by cultural assumptions and historical analogies that justify desired conclusions. Yamamoto had seen the truth. He had warned repeatedly. Nobody listened. And because nobody listened, over 2 million Japanese military personnel died, 67 cities burned, and 2 atomic bombs demonstrated that modern war had entered an era where cultural notions of honor and spirit meant nothing against physics and industrial capacity. That is the price of ignoring intelligence when politics demands war. That is the cost of mistaking comfort for weakness. That is what happens when nations underestimate their enemies. If you found this story compelling, share your thoughts in the comments. History is filled with similar miscalculations where cultural arrogance led to catastrophe. Subscribe to explore more forgotten stories that shaped our world.